Hello and assalamu alaikum, everyone and guests on this webinar, as well as colleagues presenting. This is the third webinar in our series around Ramadan and supporting people with serious mental illness. So before I go into what today's session is and introduce the speakers, I've just got some housekeeping to do, but it's quite helpful that I don't have to remember where the toilets are and where the fire escape is, because you'll know where they are, where you are. So the ask is to ask colleagues to turn off your mics if you're not one of our presenters. You've got a choice of either leaving your camera on or off. Just to let you know, this session is recorded, so if you don't want to be visible during that recording, you might want to turn it off, but that choice is yours. And if you have any questions, please do add them to the chat as the presenters present their slides. So there's lots of content today, so I'm going to keep my intro quite brief. So hello, my name is Shaq, and I'm the Associate Director for Communications and Involvement for the Bradford District and Craven Health and Care Partnership. I'm really delighted that we're joined by three colleagues today. So two colleagues are from Bradford District Care Trust who will be presenting together, and that's Halima Hafiz and Hamza Ali. I won't introduce them in terms of their job title because I'm sure they'll do that during their slides. And then following on from Halima and Hamza, it will be Zala Mir from the University of Leeds. And once the session is over, we'll end the recording, and the recording will be made available on our website in due course. Natasha, who's sat with me, who's a brilliant colleague who does all the work in the background, will just need to do some editing just to make sure it works for our website. So it'll be made available and you'll get a link as soon as possible. I've just got to remember, a bit like those people who've got a book to sell, I've got a webinar to tell you about. The final webinar in this series is on the 8th of February. And there'll be a link in the chat very shortly, which I'd welcome you to register to attend, but also to share with your colleagues, networks and contacts. So without further ado, I am the next slide person. So I'm going to share my screen and hand it over to Halima and Hamza, if that's okay.
Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. My name's Halima and I'm a CBT therapist. I work in the Bradford City Adult Community Mental Health team, and I'll let Hamza introduce himself.
And I'm Hamza. I'm an occupational therapist working at Adult Mental Health Centre.
So thank you for that introduction, Shaq. So what Hamza and I will be doing, we're going to be providing an overview into a group that we created and piloted at City CMHT. So this was around sort of Ramadan and thinking about our service users sort of working in the city team of Bradford with a client population with patients who have severe and enduring mental health difficulties. So we'll discuss a little bit about how the group was formed, key themes and ideas that came up, and we'll kind of provide a brief overview into the session content and the aims for the group that we delivered. We'll also kind of have an opportunity to discuss our personal reflections and next steps that will hopefully inspire for similar stuff to be created in your trusts or your teams as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of sort of ideas in early stages, we thought it would just be helpful to give an overview of where this came about from. I know this is webinar 3, so the first 2 have kind of provided an overview of clinical management, also a bit of an overview on Ramadan, so we won't be going into that. But just in terms of sort of some pointers that we've got, so fasting in Ramadan is a communal tradition in the Muslim world and viewed as a meaningful occupation for individuals, offering a sense of purpose, identity and belonging from the doing and the fasting in Ramadan. So in terms of our ideas at the city team, we had MDT discussions in the office about the challenges of working with service users during the month of Ramadan, kind of what some of those challenges were. People had questions as to how to go about them, and these were discussions with kind of the Muslim clinicians and just wanting some support and advice for that. From those MDT discussions, we also kind of discussed the importance of bridging the gaps as mental health professionals and sort of meeting the needs of diverse population that we work with in Bradford. So that's where kind of Hamza and I, so Hamza from the occupational therapy side and myself from the psychology side, collaboratively worked together and created and also piloted what we call the Dawn to Dusk Ramadan project. So we had the support of Hafsa Iqbal, who is an OT at North, so she supported us to facilitate it. We're going to talk shortly a little bit about the themes that came up in our team. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I guess thinking a little bit about some of the themes that came up and the impact on service users with severe mental illness within our team that came up. So assessment team reported an increase in referrals after Ramadan. A lot of staff members reported their service users were starting to disengage during Ramadan. There was poor compliance with medication, disrupted sleep patterns, changes in routine. Sort of some of the psychological impacts, increase in low mood, feeling quite isolated and disconnected with their faith, but also with their communities. And a lot of staff members had some worries about the risk of relapse and potential hospital admission. So throughout the presentation, we will kind of be touching on these themes a little bit more, both from what Hamza and I have put together and also what Ghazala has put together. So hopefully we can cover that. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a brief overview into the group aims. So this was an occupational focused, psychologically informed intervention. It was a peer support reflective space, and we included elements of psychoeducation. So kind of some of that looked like, from a CBT perspective, emotional regulation, incorporating behavioral activation, mindfulness, and also used occupational therapy models. Obviously, it was a group for Ramadan, so we also incorporated sort of aspects between those OT psychology links, but also with the religion of Islam and kind of making those key connections, which Hamza will talk about shortly. So the three main aims of the group were reducing risk of relapse and individuals becoming unwell. It was important to promote sort of the importance of mental health in a culturally meaningful way, and for individuals to experience occupational engagement in Ramadan without having to fast. Yeah, so these were the three aims, and what Hamza's going to do shortly is he's going to talk a little bit about what each session looked like. We are obviously happy to answer any questions at the end, or if anybody wants more information. Next slide, please. So I will pass you over to Hamza here.
Right, guys. So the first session was essentially looking at how do we welcome Ramadan. And I just want to briefly mention, the sort of link with occupational therapy and Ramadan. A big part of who we are and the sense of identity we carry comes from what we do. And within the Muslim culture and traditions, fasting is a communal tradition, as Salim has previously mentioned. And this is something that people feel, particularly who can't fast, disconnected, isolated, and disengaged. So therefore, when they can't fast, they tend to think that the point of welcoming in Ramadan, isn't really there either. So our sort of invitation from session one was really understanding, how can we welcome how can we enjoy the festivities and the preparations for Ramadan, and actually what do they look like for people in the context of what's meaningful to them. So in this sort of session, we looked at occupational values, occupational interests. We basically also looked at the impact that all of this essentially has on a person's emotional sense of well-being. So the invitation was really kind of therapeutically getting our service users to think about how they can still feel connected and a part of this celebration, even if they're not going to be sort of adopting the traditional methods of celebrating Ramadan, which is by fasting. So that was session one. Next session, please. So in session two, what we kind of looked at was self-compassion and sort of mercy. And I just want to briefly mention here that there's a very famous quote and hadith of the beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, that says that the first 10 days of Ramadan are days of mercy, the second 10 days are days of forgiveness, and the last 10 days are of transformation and change. And what we really wanted to do was kind of weave in and embed these three themes of mercy, forgiveness, and change into the sort of whole program. And we did so by incorporating session two and basing this around self-compassion and mercy. And allowing and inviting our services to think about mercy from the perspective of what it means when we ask the question around self-compassion and self-kindness. I guess that the sort of typical and traditional understanding of mercy is based on the divine hierarchy order, that is God sort of ascending his mercies, upon his sort of creation, and that is of course the case. But we wanted to sort of unpick this from a relational perspective, inviting people to think about how this also involves ourselves as individuals, allowing ourselves permission to be kind, to be self-compassionate, to be merciful. And then we did this by reflecting on the 3 elements of self-compassion model by Dr. Kristen Neff. And this is sort of understanding, what self-kindness is, and understanding that it's actually not punishment, particularly when we know that patients were feeling that they were guilty of a punishment or of a sin that they've committed, and hence they're suffering this deprivation from being able to fast. So I think this was really sort of addressing, to alleviate that sense of guilt and informing a therapeutic understanding around sort of self-kindness. And then we had the sense of common humanity, the idea that everybody goes through this together. So this togetherness, and that you're not alone, in this experience of, not fasting. And in Islam, there's the exception that is based on medical grounds, and this is actually reason to believe, and an understanding of how this is a shared common experience. And then we had the mindfulness aspect, which was sort of, really sort of inviting people, to exercise mindfulness through different sort of ways. And one of the techniques we sort of introduced was gratitude journal. So reflecting on what you can do as opposed to what you can't do, and being sort of, solution focused and strength based, in our approach. So this was session 2. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. So session 3 basically was linking back to the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, around the second days being based on forgiveness. And this was a very interesting session because this was giving people the opportunity to think about what forgiveness really means from the perspective of self-care. This basically gave us the opportunity to reflect on how emotion regulation can be constructed and approached from a way which is psychologically informed, and also by means of engaging in meaningful occupations. And this is basically just a chart that you see on the screen, and it's like an emotions wheel. We actually kind of went through this, and it was really, really sort of meaningful and helpful for service users, really getting them to think about what the emotion is and what is the sort of underpinning value or belief associated with that. And then bringing this all back, to the idea of forgiveness, from the Islamic perspective, about forgiveness not being something which is about punishment or, holding you blameworthy or guilty against something that you've done, but more about the idea of learning to let go and having this sort of approach in maybe taking the next step forward in life. So more about letting go as opposed to kind of being responsible for something wrong that you've done. So this was a very sort of therapeutically challenging session for service users. And again, basically, as you can see from the picture there, that there's a tug of war, kind of thinking about the conflict of emotions that service users feel, and what would the sort of conversation be between these sort of emotional states, and how could we sort of channel that in a way which is culturally meaningful, but therapeutically more helpful as well. Next slide, please. And last but not least was the session 4, which was my favorite because it was encapsulating the sort of imagery of nature, of how a caterpillar actually goes from being a caterpillar to butterfly. And this sort of session was really reverberating the theme of change and transformation, which is, I guess, basically the theme of the last 10 days, thinking about how do we embed the learning of Ramadan, in our everyday to-day lives. And I think when we think about change and transformation, often it can be the case that we think of this as being something which has to be massive, monumental, gigantic, something which has to be huge. And this was the sort of offer to our service users to think about how this doesn't have to be the case, the sort of change that we embed in our day-to-day lives could be something very small, it could be subtle, and it could be very natural, to the pace that is suitable for us. And we kind of gave reference to different sayings of the beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. One famous one, which is that even removing the thorn from the ground or from the pathway is, sadaqah is actually equivalent to giving charity. So something which is like a thorn is a metaphor for something which can go unnoticed by people, because on a pedestrian pathway or on a road, who would notice a thorn? But to actually even remove something which is unnoticeable, it goes rewarded. It doesn't go unnoticed, in the eyes, of God, and it shouldn't go unnoticed in your own sort of reflection as well. And then the idea of inviting patients to think about nature in the context of how the Quran invites people, to travel, to sort of embrace and develop their learning experiences through traveling, by observing, different aspects of nature. And the caterpillar to butterfly is a very powerful one, because, as we know, the caterpillar goes through phases of change, phases basically, before it actually transforms into a butterfly. So this idea of how, change doesn't have to be something really, really radical, but it could be something very moderate, very gentle, very, very light. And we should hold ourselves, to celebrate our achievement, irrespective of how small it might be, how subtle it might be, and how long it actually might take. And therefore, basically, this session was really, really instrumental in communicating the celebration in a therapeutic way, by reflecting on the okayness of change being, as mentioned before, small, subtle, gradual, by engaging in the things that are meaningful to us, the things that we basically call meaningful occupations. Next slide, please.
Thank you for that, Hamza. Yeah, so I guess just following on from the session content, we thought it'd be useful to share our reflections, because it was just a pilot in the city team. And I guess we've got some thoughts and ideas to take it to the next step, which I will talk about shortly. But in terms of our reflections, service users highlighted the need for having access to such spaces that allowed them to feel a sense of belonging, purpose, value, and identity. So that was quite powerful, because patients talked about kind of how important such spaces are for them, and gave some really lovely feedback that we'll talk about later as well. With increased awareness around the quick connection between mental health and faith, this increased people's self-motivation and their experience of their sense of self. The group gave a voice to service users to communicate their thoughts, feelings, emotions, and experiences in a judgment-free space. As it was a pilot and kind of it was done in quite a short space of time, we did experience low attendance, but we felt that service users and care coordinators maybe did not have a clear understanding or expectation of what this group was about. I guess following on from that, this group has received a lot of attention across services, across the trust, both locally and across the country, I guess. So we are hoping that we can really kind of get on with this and think about the next steps and kind of advertise it and create it on a much bigger platform. So that's great to know that came from the pilot. The group also highlighted the effectiveness of MDT working, so as occupational therapy and psychology collaborated successfully. Next slide, please. So just in terms of the next steps, so the plan is to roll it out again at City CMHT. So we've got the support of Hamera, who's an OT, and Pfizer, who's an assistant psychologist. We've also taken a research strand. So Pfizer's currently conducting some research to support with the finding and evidence of kind of the effect of service users within Ramadan. And it'll also be an opportunity to identify further needs. Eventually, the plan is to disseminate the content to other CMHTs and services within BDCT. Again, it has received a lot of interest, so that's the plan. Once we've kind of rolled it out again, had a look at the content and maybe identifying further needs, we can get onto that. One of the suggestions from one of our service users who attended and completed the group was to offer a 6-week group. So she thought having a pre-Ramadan, so a week before Ramadan, the 4 weeks during Ramadan, and then a week after Ramadan would be really valuable for her. So that's something that we are taking on board. Again, this is kind of much more in the future, but we'd like to also add a systemic strand to the group to support families and service users. Some of the things that came up is when service users are maybe not kind of engaging in the doing of fasting. Family members or some family members may not take to that very well or may not quite understand that. So we'd like to be able to support families as well as service users. And I guess kind of the next part is the creative flair, which Hamza has suggested, just to kind of explore and promote and raise awareness for mental health using creative arts and produce that in a culturally meaningful way. And I guess, yeah, just what we're continuing to do is collaborate and network in community spaces to expand our offer and support of mental health during Ramadan. Next slide.
So this is some of the feedback that we captured from running the program. One patient said, "I feel I have needed something like this my whole life and wish a space like this existed sooner." So I guess we can hear the sense of relief, in that sort of feedback. Another service user voiced that they really enjoyed this space and it was a great idea. The recognition and validation had really helped that individual feel so much better. Thank you, they say. It has been a pleasure and I am thankful for this space. Another service user mentioned, "I learned that you really are not on your own, especially in Ramadan. I feel better after completing the group." So that was some lovely feedback that we received. Next session, please. Next slide, please.
Yep, so I'm just conscious of time, but I quickly wanted to touch on a workshop that we offered for staff as well. I know kind of the focus of our presentation has been on the group that we had for service users, but myself, my colleagues, Anila and Mike, we run monthly workshops in the City CMHT team called Cultural Diversity Workshops. And I guess that's an opportunity. It's a safe, non-judgmental space, and it's an opportunity to discuss several key themes that come up with service users in Bradford. And I guess we are within the team itself, we're a diverse team. We've got kind of lots of different modalities, lots of different experience, and it's an opportunity for staff to come together every month and present on different topics to learn from each other. And one of the workshops that we offered last year, and we will be offering it again for City this year, was for working with service users during Ramadan. Sort of key discussions included looking at our local demographics, exploring the effects of Ramadan on our service users, any barriers and suggestions on how to overcome these. Some really brief takeaway points from that. So I guess it's thinking about, particularly for care coordinators, to working with the service user, understanding their needs, being mindful of any challenges that may be unique to them. It's important to take a culturally sensitive approach, sort of taking on board the spiritual values, the beliefs and interests of service users, and exploring its relevance to mental health and well-being. Encouraging them to maintain regular contact with services, linking with local community support, for example, mosques and faith centres, is really important. And I guess it's just important to share and have access to resources that are available both locally and nationally on Ramadan. So that was just some brief takeaway points.
So guys, we're just going to finish off by looking at this poem called The Guest House. And this was the poem that we used to conclude the program in the final session. So I'll just read this through, and if you can all just spend a moment holding this in mind and thinking about what it actually means to you. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So I guess, guys, the Rumi sort of point, what it encapsulates is, this idea of looking at your emotions and your feelings as visitors and guests. And it's really communicating the message around self-honor, self-respect, and it's instilling, this value of hope and motivation in a way which is culturally meaningful and relevant to service users. So that's basically the poem that we used, to beautifully end our last session. Thank you.
I know we've got an any questions slide here, but I think we are taking questions at the end. But yeah, thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Halima and Hamza. Jazakallah for not just your presentation, actually, the project that you've done. I like the fact that you described how you set it up and how it's inspiring, hopefully, others to do something similar. So Jazakallah for doing that for the communities locally here. And I hope that this spreads in other communities and helps others. So I'm going to now hand over to Ghazala. So I'm going to pop onto the next slide and then hand over to Ghazala. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shak. Okay, so it's great to be here, and what I'm going to be talking about is the findings from a randomized control trial that we carried out in Bradford. As you can see, I had colleagues from the University of Leeds who helped me with this project, and it was done in collaboration with members of Bradford District and Craven Health and Care Partnership. So next slide, you can see that there is a lot of reason for doing a trial in this area. Internationally and nationally, we have policies that promote culturally appropriate treatments, and there's a large body of research evidence that shows that faith-sensitive therapies and culturally adapted therapies can reduce levels of depression, and actually some evidence that in Muslim communities they may work more quickly than standard therapies. In terms of people from Muslim backgrounds, we know that religion is a prime identity and that they're more likely to use religious coping techniques, or turning to religion for support when they have mental ill health than other faith groups in the UK. Within the trial that we conducted, we selected behavioural activation as the therapy that we adapted for this community. It has a evidence base that is equivalent to CBT, but it has a more explicit focus on client values, which allowed us to bring in attention to religious values. And also, actually, it's easier to train people in BA than it is to train people in CBT. So BAM, which is the culturally adapted version, has already been piloted in Bradford back in 2015 when we developed the approach, and it was found to be feasible and acceptable. So what we did in the trial that we finished in last year was really roll this out and look at it in a wider context and actually evaluate it properly. The randomized control trial in, if you just go back a little bit, so we also did a randomized control trial in Pakistan, and both of the trials have showed significantly better results than for CBT or social interventions, and it's planned to be rolled out in the coming year. Yeah, thanks. So next slide. And the reason that we got better results when we looked at this was because there was better engagement. People were not dropping out as much from this therapy. And we, as I say, we focused on values in terms of the therapy delivery. And as you can see on the right here, this values assessment tool was used. It's actually taken from a therapy called ACTS. And it sets out a whole range of areas in which people might, feel that their values it's very important value to them. So people are given the opportunity to select religion or spirituality, but in a way that's not actually promoting that. So they're not directly asked, is religion important to you? They're asked to select from this tool which issues are important to them, and to put a score maybe out of 10 next to each one. So it's very individual. There's no right or wrong values in therapy. People are quite, free to not choose religion or spirituality, in which case they just get standard BA. But crucially for behavioural activation, the behaviours that they might be encouraged to sort of get more active in are consistent with their values. And what we found in the study was that that people were very motivated by their Islamic values. As I say, it was a prime identity for many of them, although for others it might not be. And it was important to recognise that diversity and support people's choice. But for some people, they described it as very important, the core of my identity, 110%. More than everything. And in one case, somebody said that she wouldn't be here, that she would have committed suicide if it hadn't been for her Islamic identity. And then, as I say, there were others who, they might practice to a certain extent. I went to Jummah, which is a Friday prayer, but I don't believe in these mullahs, these imams. So people might have ambivalent feelings towards their religion. And then others might say, no, religion's our personal thing. We don't want it to have anything to do with therapy. So actually, it's really important that we recognise that people need to, to indicate, it needs to be client-led in terms of how much attention to religion takes place within therapy. And can I just say, I should have just said I've got a bit of a cold, so sorry if I start spluttering halfway through. But can I just say, if people have got questions for the as I'm going through, just put them in the chat and I'll try to address them either as I go through or at the end. So next slide, please. So the way that we adapted behavioural activation was to look at spiritual understandings of depression from the point of view of Islamic teachings and also Muslim communities. We did a literature review on interventions that paid attention to faith more generally, not just for the Muslim community. And we interviewed expert practitioners and academics. We published those results. And what we found from that was that religion, is a potentially positive resource for health and for mental health. And that was already confirming things that we'd found, in previous studies. There's an emphasis on acting upon beliefs within Islam, just as there is within behavioural activation. So if you think about the 5 pillars of Islam, the first pillar is belief in God. And the other 4 pillars, performing the prayer, giving charity from your, giving obligatory charity from your wealth, fasting in Ramadan, and performing the Hajj if you're able to do that. They're all behaviors. They're all sort of active indications of your belief in God. And as I've said, client-led engagement was the key issue that came out, and also the fact that religious and other cultural influences might be intertwined, and there might be some cultural issues that are actually going against the Islamic teachings, and it can be important to differentiate those. Okay, next slide. Right, so again, things that came out of the literature and the interviews was a really important distinction between positive religious coping and negative religious coping. So people could engage with religious teachings in ways that actually increase their resilience, their hope, making sense of their experience and their self-esteem. But there were other ways of engaging with religion that could lead people to focus on being punished, getting obsessive in their behavior, feeling very guilty. I mean, some of the things that I'm going to say overlap a lot with what Halima and Hamza have said. So people could feel guilty, for example, around the time of Ramadan. People might feel guilty that they're not, they're not taking part in this month. Maybe they feel they're being punished by God because they're depressed. That might lead to them feeling more despair and hopelessness. I mean, if you just click once, please, Shaq, you'll see my arrows are missing. Yeah, so our answer to that, really, what came out of that in terms of what we need to do in terms of adaptation, is to encourage valued religious activity, but without inducing these negative kind of feelings of being punished and guilt. And then the second thing that came out was that, many people within Muslim communities equate an Islamic way of life with good health. And they feel that Islamic scriptures support healing. And there's a lot of teachings that actually link values and belief with actions. So what came out then, again, just one click, please, is that, there is a whole range of religious teachings that are that could be a resource for recovery from depression that actually parallel what the behavioural activation approach is trying to do. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, and I mean, when somebody's put a question in the thing about black magic and jinns, and actually understanding that how people understand depression might be really different from the Western model, and that doesn't matter really. We're not actually there to necessarily say you've got to believe in the Western model of depression. We accept that that there might be different understandings, but we still say this approach can still help you, whatever you think might be the cause of the depression. So we identified quite a lot of parallels between Islamic teachings and behavioural activation. I've highlighted a few there. So being active, I've mentioned, don't just rely on God, don't be fatalistic. There are teachings that say you've got to actually take action yourself, that there should be this congruence between what you believe in and your actions. And as mentioned in the previous presentation, small changes can have a major influence, and there are teachings specifically about that. And all the other things on there were areas where we found teachings that would parallel what the behavioural activation therapists might be wanting to promote. Next slide, please. So in the adaptation, one of the major things that we did was to create a client self-help booklet. And this is a collection of teachings from the Quran and prophetic teachings. And this is maybe a little bit where we've done something quite a little different from what Halima and Hamza described. We tried to make this approach as accessible to as wide a range of Muslims as possible. So we were really careful not to bring any teachings from specific kind of sect within Islam, so to make it as non-sectarian as possible. So to stick to the 2 key sources that almost every Muslim would accept, the Quran and the prophetic teachings. And then, to recognize that this familiar, valued framework would be a resource for both the therapist and the client in terms of developing their own knowledge for therapists, but also for the client being reminded of things that might actually, help them to feel more hopeful and to feel, more kind towards themselves. And the important thing for therapists is that they don't have to believe the teachings. You don't have to be a Muslim to deliver this, but you do have to believe that they can help the client. There has to be that level of sincerity that, this approach can help. The teachings are linked to positive religious coping and the principles of behavioral activation. The booklet was developed over a number of stages. We had a clinical psychologist, Wali Wardak, who's, was in Bradford, might still be in Bradford at the time, helped us develop this. And it includes action points and space for reflection. So this booklet is on the web. I'll give you a web link at the end. All the resources and the manual as well is on the web, on the University of Leeds website. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a page from the booklet. So, and just to show you, it doesn't actually say this in the booklet, but the BA approach would be, you need to be active, do your part. And in the client self-help booklet, this is sort of the teaching that is highlighted is called Tie Your Camel. And a prophetic teaching is within the booklet, which says that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, noticed a Bedouin leaving his camel without tying it. And he asked, "Why don't you tie down your camel?" And the Bedouin answered, "I put my trust in Allah." And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Tie your camel first, then put your trust in Allah." So the key teaching here is, don't leave it to God to sort out your situation. He will help you sort out your situation, but you have to actually take some action first. So don't be fatalistic about this. Remember that you have to play a part. You have choices to make as well. Okay, next. Next slide. Yeah, so positive religious coping was really important in terms of being meaningful to clients. So the feedback that we got from the trial was that, therapists felt that, bringing the two things together, the religious teachings with the therapeutic aims, was really helpful. That the client, it made the client realize in a way that just sort of saying that from a secular point of view didn't really give them that realization that this was actually something really important in terms of their own identity. And then service users saying, that things that were important to her values, these were the things that she was working with, not something that was outside her value framework. And then the last quote there, it helped her to realign to meaning and to recognize the strengths she already had and to draw on that as a strength, draw on her religious belief as a strength. So on the left here, you've got some examples from the, sorry, keep going. Sorry, yeah, on the left in the box, you can see some examples from the self-help booklet, and on the right, what people were saying about this. So there's a list of the names of God within the self-help booklet. And in terms of self-care, resilience, some of these names are really important. So remembering that God is the most merciful, the most compassionate. He acts, there's an explanation that he acts with extreme kindness. He wills goodness and mercy for his creatures. One of his names is the kind, the one who's compassionate and indulgent. So when people are being hard on themselves, it's important for them to be reminded. It can be important for them to be reminded about this. And then, in terms of doing what people can manage, to be kind on yourself, not to feel that you've let yourself down if you haven't managed to do a major thing, but taking things one step at a time. So this prophetic teaching about, which deed is most beloved to Allah, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, the one that is done regularly, even if it is little. And you can see that number 10 at the end. We gave a reference for every teaching that we put in there, reference from the Quran or the prophetic teaching, so people could look them up and check, that this was from an authentic source. And then the sentence at the end, do whatever you can manage, start small and build up. This is what a therapist might say, to a client, and we had that in the self-help booklet. And what people were saying was about this was that, that when they felt that they weren't of use to anyone, the therapist would, refer to this kind of teaching. God is kind, God is forgiving, you should be able to forgive yourself. And the second quote there, that using the booklet to remind myself how to keep positive, using it when something is tough and I'm feeling a bit down, and going back to the booklet, and it helps. So just a reminder about teachings from within the client's own value framework that are motivating, that remind them of things that they might have, not really focused on. Next slide, please. And again, you know, self-care, cleanliness and evolution might be, a key thing that people struggle with when they're depressed. So again, some teachings on the left there about, taking care of yourself, your body being a trust. And on the right, people saying about how that helped bring them back to their normal self, feeling more motivated in a way that they weren't able to do when they had been, sort of in the depths of their depression. And in that case, the person was using drugs. And then the fact that it was set out as a self-help booklet was appreciated by many people. I think the point is that this is supporting people to draw on things that they already know about, but they do need that support. They might already know about these teachings, but they're not in a position when they're depressed actually to do this kind of thing for themselves. They might not be able to draw out what it actually means for them in the same way that they would with the support of a therapist, or with something like a self-help booklet, actually getting them to think about things in a different way. Next slide, please. And having hope is really important. Again, some teachings on the left there, not about not losing hope, gaining strength through believing that difficulties will not last. There, a verse from the Quran that with every difficulty there is relief, and that, on no soul do we place a burden greater than it can bear. This is really encouraging for people who feel that, they're having a really difficult time. And people were saying when we interviewed them, they didn't want to lose hope, and that they were feeling hopeless, and they felt a lot better through this approach. Next slide, please. So there were, in the pilot study in particular, when we developed this approach, there were some worries from therapists about, this wasn't something they were trained in. It made them move out of their comfort zone. They felt they didn't have enough knowledge of Islam. They were worried about preaching and imposing. They hadn't been trained in this kind of approach. And there are lots of social and historical influences on what knowledge is seen as valid. So Islamic teachings are not normally seen as a valid, legitimate kind of knowledge framework. And we live in a society where there's a lot of Islamophobia. So actually there were some comfort zone issues in relation to that. And also the fit with your own identity and beliefs. If you're promoting something that you don't actually believe in, how does that work? But the approach that we took, from all the evidence that we gathered was, it's not important to be a religious expert. Even if you're a Muslim therapist, you don't have to be a religious expert, and you're really just focusing on the therapy side of things. You may know less than your clients in a whole range of areas about being a parent, about being married, for example. So you can learn from the client booklet, and you can signpost people to religious experts if they need that kind of advice. But it's important to make space for the discussion about how important this might be to people, and then be led by the client. And when therapists got the positive response from clients, when they practiced this approach and saw just how important it could be to people, that helped increase their confidence. And actually what we're doing here is decolonizing knowledge, saying that non-Western frameworks have a lot to offer, and they can be really helpful to people. And it's important for everyone to just be more reflexive about, the stance that they're coming from, and to recognize that it actually might be shutting things down for clients. And it's really important to be sincere in this approach. It can't be delivered by someone who believes that religion is harmful, or believes that Islam, is a religion for terrorists, or, it has to be something that you actually accept is a valid knowledge framework. Okay, next. So in our randomized control trial, I just quickly whiz through this. We found, I'm not going to read about the methods there, you can see them, but in the green box, the better outcomes were, statistically shown, and they were explained by improved retention. So CBT does work, but people just drop out of it. So, we were getting similar results for each session that people attended, but they weren't attending as many sessions of CBT, and far less sessions of the social groups. This was delivered by IAPT service in Bradford, but also by voluntary sector practitioners who'd been trained in BAM. And we found that there was little evidence of difference in performance. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide, yeah. So, the qualitative study, as I've mentioned, showed positive religious coping was really helpful. And I think what's important to notice here is that if you don't use this approach, people will still come with these ideas that they're being punished by God, and they're not being addressed in therapy. So actually, that may be the reason that they're dropping out. And they may say things like, I've stopped praying. And if people don't realize, therapists don't realize how important that is to them, they will drop out. So these meaningful activities and this motivation is really important. It's really important to recognize whether religion is important to somebody, and then to address the whole identity of a person and not force them to leave part of their identity, especially if it's really important to them, not force them to leave that at home and not bring it into the clinical setting. And just to say, we did interview people who dropped out as well as people who were who used the approach. Okay, next slide, please. And so I think this is about transforming services for Muslim patients from services that actually replicate the social exclusion that we find in wider society, where there may be poor access and engagement with services. There may be a lack of early intervention. We know that there is lower recovery, lower trust in services within minority ethnic communities, many of which are, from Muslim backgrounds. We know that there's stereotyping of people from Muslim backgrounds. There's a high level of Islamophobia. And in mental health settings, the use of prevent can be actually really, all these things add to environmental stresses. So actually engaging with services can add to the stresses that people feel rather than making them feel better. And, within current approaches, there hadn't been before this. There are pockets of approaches, but in standard practice, there's no engagement with Muslim value frameworks or community resources, or very little engagement. So what we're trying to do through this approach is to develop more inclusive services, and through better engagement with institutions and with therapists, to encourage reflexive attitudes. The training actually gets people thinking about what they actually feel about religion in general, Islam in particular, to recognize where they might be stereotyping, any prejudices that they may have. And this approach recognizes the legitimacy of Islam as a helpful value framework, and that in itself increases trust amongst clients, increases their motivation, their engagement. They feel more included in services, and it decreases the stigma of actually attending services and of having depression. And the approach itself targets adverse social circumstances. So it's not just about religion, it actually helps people do behaviors beyond religious activities, but that's a route in that can actually help people feel motivated to engage with activation assignments. And as I've mentioned before, there may be a need to collaborate with those who have relevant expertise in religious teachings. So we're not expecting therapists to be religious experts. Next slide, please. So you can see the website there. You're going to get the, if you look up my name and Leeds University, it'll probably come up anyway. All the resources are on there. We haven't yet put on the report from the randomized control trial, but I will put that up soon. And we're hoping to publish that soon. There is a study that has been done in Pakistan, which I think is on the website. If not, I'll get that put up as well. And then, the next thing to say is just, any questions, and I think that's across all speakers now.
Thank you so much, Jazakallah for that, and apologies. As you can tell, I've got a bit of a problem with my cursor, so I couldn't come off camera or mic there, and I've got a little bit too proactive on moving the slides on, so apologies for that. But can I just say, before we open up for questions, I just wanted to say your research, I know, is definitely having an impact on how we design and deliver services. So, thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to pull out, which for me was really important, which ran throughout the slides, but was right at the beginning, is there's this idea that that if you're a Muslim, that you're part of a homogenous group and your belief systems will be the same, and how you approach your religion will be the same. So I just wanted to mention that. But this isn't about me; it's about colleagues joining this webinar. I think there's someone with a hand up already before we even go to the questions in the chat. So, Nicholas, if we hand over to you.
Thanks so much. Really great work, and very interesting to see. I'm working in adult eating disorder in Bedfordshire and Luton, and our access for our population is not proportionate. Our caseloads are not reflecting our populations. We're doing some work. I was just wondering, is it Ghazala? I was really interested in the emphasis on values as the guide for behaviour, and thinking about ACT and the acceptance-based third wave models. behavioural activation makes very good sense in so many ways for any population, I think. But I wondered whether you'd been thinking about values and emotion-driven behaviours and valued behaviours, and whether ACT has been in something, yeah, that's been considered also.
So ACT came up because during the training for the pilot study, people were sort of saying, if you ask a Muslim person, is religion important to you? We didn't have that tool at the time. If you ask a Muslim person, is religion important to you? It will be hard for them to say no, because it's it's such an important part of the culture within Muslim communities. It could be hard for people to say no. And then within the training, we had psychologists who were saying, well, what if we use this tool? So ACT wasn't specifically something we were looking at. And the reason we particularly focused on behavioural activation was partly because of the focus on values, but also it's much more. Dave Eakers and other colleagues in the UK have shown it's much more parsimonious in terms of it's much easier to train people. So this was developed in the UK, but actually I'm working with people in Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Turkey, where there are Muslim majorities, and they're still delivering the Western-based model. And they don't have the sort of resources in low-income settings. They need approaches that actually are quick to train and that can be delivered by people who are not necessarily, clinical psychologists or even psychologists. So this approach is much more promising in terms of behavioural activation was chosen for that reason, and also because there is research in Pakistan that shows that it's accessible to people with lower levels of education. The focus on behaviour rather than on abstract thinking, which CBT might, more focus on more, is much more accessible to people who don't have a high level of education. So from the point of view of resources and point of view of reach, behavioural activation answers so many, it just ticks so many boxes, really. But to be honest, I feel that any approach that is, that is culturally adapted, could potentially, we just need to build up the evidence base, really. I'm not saying this is the only approach. I'm just saying there are lots of different approaches that are taking place. We just need to build up the evidence base, really, for all of them.
Thank you, Ghazala. I think there was a couple of questions, but it looks as though they've been answered by Halima a bit further back. But obviously, if colleagues feel that need any further responses to that, do put your hand up. But the other questions I've got, Ghazala, is a quick one, which is around, is there a copy of this client self-help booklet that we can access to give to our own clients?
Yeah, so I said it's available on the University of Leeds website, and it's available in more than one language. We have it in Urdu, Arabic. We have an audio in Urdu as well. And there is a Turkish version that my PhD student developed. I've still got to get that off her to put on the website. And we're applying for funding now to try to get this developed, and delivered in Indonesia and Malaysia. Although those aren't major kind of groups here in the UK, but the work is developing to try and get this into other languages. I think perhaps we need to look at the Bangladeshi population in the UK and trying to get a version for that population too. But yeah, it's freely available. We're not precious about it at all. We really want people to pick this up and deliver it.
Thank you, Ghazala. I was going to come on to the topic of jinn and black magic, but before I do, there's another question on the self-help booklet from CAF, which is, what does the training involve for practitioners in behavioural activation?
So if people are already trained in psychological therapies, then it would be a 2-day training course. I have managed to cut that down to 1 day, although ideally it's a 2-day training course. Where actually I'm working with the IAP service in Leeds at the moment and in Bradford to try and work out ways in which we can train trainers rather than it being me delivering all the time, because it's not sustainable for me to be the only person. I usually bring in people who've already delivered this approach to help. And I think what could perhaps work in the long run is having recordings of me, because just presenting the research side of it, and then having more face-to-face with the people who are actually delivering it, because that is really where the real learning happens about how it works in practice. And then if people don't have psychological training, in the voluntary sector, what we said was that we had a criteria that they should have graduate level education, and that they would have a week of behavioural activation training. Again, this has been evidence-based that you can get similar results to CBT therapists through that kind of training. So the University of Bradford, we had a colleague there who delivered a week of BA training, and then that was followed by the 2 days on the cultural adaptation, and they were assessed for competency after that 1 week in the beginning.
Thank you, Ghazala. I think a colleague put their hand up and it's back down because I'm guessing they wanted some response around the issue of black magic and jinns. And I think not just yourself, Ghazala, I don't know if Halim and Hamza have got anything specific to that as well. But I'll go to you first, Ghazala, and if Halim and Hamza have anything to add, please do.
So black magic and jinn we mention in the therapist manual as potential explanations for depression within Muslim communities that shouldn't be dismissed. You know, the Quran mentions the existence of black magic and the existence of jinn. So it's actually something that all Muslims will believe in, you know, if they believe in the Quran. So we can't say, well, that's, you know, and when we did the first training, we had a very experienced practitioner saying, well, they're delusional if they believe in that. You know, somebody who was actually a supervisor saying that. So it's really important to dispel that this is something that all Muslims will believe in, and you don't have to psychoeducate people out of that. What in this approach, what people will the response would be, you know, I understand that that's, you know, how you understand what's happening to you, but this approach can still help you. And in the client booklet, we have a section on protecting yourself from harm. So the different types of things that you can do from an Islamic point of view to protect yourself if you feel that you're in danger or you're at risk of harm from supernatural sources or anything else.
Thank you, Ghazala.
Halim and Hamza might have something to add to that.
I think, Ghazala, you've covered everything. I think in terms of that coming up we're in like the baby stages of our group, I guess. So it's something that we are looking and thinking about different topics. But in terms of black magic and jinn, that's we've run a workshop for staff, not necessarily a discussion we've had with service users, but we've done it for staff who've been really kind of keen to know more about the kind of spiritual side of black magic, jinn. And that was really well attended from psychiatrists, social workers, nurses, and it was a really kind of valuable session for people to understand a little bit more about what that is, and that is a real experience for a lot of people, rather than sort of what the Western framework might consider a delusion or a hallucination or whatever. So yeah, I think that's something that we need to kind of incorporate and build into our work in the future.
Thank you, Halima. And I think a colleague called Bana, if I've got that right, has got a hand up. Please feel free to ask your question.
Hello. Yeah, it's Abu Bakr. So thank you for that, Shak. Yeah, my question really was in terms to Halima and to Hamza really, is we see quite a lot of clients who obviously, you know, fasting is a really valued time for Muslim patients because of their underlying mental health conditions and the medications that they're on. What advice do you give in terms of those people who want to fast and still comply, because we see compliance rates, you know, going down and relapse happening? So I know what we've done in our trust of Swift. I just wanted to know what your experiences are, because we've now linked in with our trust pharmacists and our chaplaincy team, etc. So have you done something similar where you encourage people to consider sort of the risk factors in terms of compliance, and also some of the, you know, people think it's a very black and white, either you fast or you don't fast, and there's no middle road. Actually, adinul yusrun, which means that Islam is very easy, and there's lots of exceptions for different sets of conditions. People are not encouraged to fast, especially if they've got serious underlying mental health conditions. That's going to affect them relapsing and possibly ending up in crisis. So have you had any experience, Hamza or Halima, in terms of some of that work?
So Hamza, do you have anything to add before I say?
So yeah, Abu Bakr, thank you for your question. It's a very good question. I think, you know, hopefully moving forward in our project, that is basically something we want to do. We want to kind of sort of expand our network with sort of other sort of professionals, potentially, you know, the pharmacy team as well, and think about how we can get that sort of medical advice as well. But at this stage, where we're at the moment, it was more about looking at the sort of permission that the Quran gives, and what does that permission look like? What does it actually mean? And like you said, Islam, the deen is made to be easy, it's made to be accessible, it's not made to be difficult or burdensome. So we basically use this opportunity with this pilot project to make the therapeutic links with some of the sort of neutral understandings of Islam, which don't sort of push belief towards any sect, but propagate or promote a neutral sort of understanding, such as, for example, the verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, I think in Ghazala's sort of point of reference, it's been mentioned as well about God not burdening people or not burdening people. So thinking about basically what your duty and your role and responsibility is to yourself, as much as it is to Allah, and how you actually understanding self-care and your duty and responsibility to yourself is actually also a form of ibadah. It's also a form of worship, because you're through self-care you're showing honor, to a gift that God has given you, a blessing that He has given you. So that's basically, I guess, the sort of message that we try to communicate throughout the sort of program. But hopefully, our sort of next stages of thinking is, to maybe network, with other professionals. I mean, informally, in an informal capacity, we have already done that, and hence that really support, the development and formulation of this project. We've got a pharmacy team on site, so we did basically do all of that, to rationally reason, why this project is needed in the first place. But in terms of having a professional come in, to deliver some content on that, that isn't something that we've actually done as of yet. But we obviously, inshallah, in the stages we're evolving, we're developing, and the view is to expand, and that is something we can keep in mind.
Thank you for that. Well, we're doing a webinar on the, I think it's 29th of Feb, a couple of weeks before Ramadan, where we're going to have one of our chaplains, one of our consultant psychiatrists and pharmacist colleagues talking about the impact of fasting and medication on and all that. So I'll probably send that to Shaq or someone to maybe promote, and it'll be an open invite. Whoever can make it, inshallah. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Halima. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to follow on. I think Hamza did answer that in terms of our project and our involvement, but just we have kind of signposted people to different sort of local and national resources on things on sort of Ramadan medication, as well as other stuff. So I guess we've been at that stage, so hopefully we can expand on that further.
Thank you so much. So apologies, I've let this session run a little bit longer, but don't tell anyone I did that. It's been really fascinating, and there's lots of people who obviously had to leave a little bit early, but they've posted some really kind comments in terms of the learning that they've got out of this. So all that's left for me to do is thank you, Halima, thank you, Hamza, thank you, Ghazala. And, events don't happen without somebody behind the scenes doing lots of work. So I will also thank my colleague, Natasha, for all of her hard work for today and for all the hard work, full stop. And then finally, these webinars are a result of a collaboration we're doing with the British Islamic Medical Association. So I just want to say thank you to them. So there's one more to go, 8th of Feb, and that'll be the end of this series, but there'll be an evaluation. Please do share your thoughts, and hopefully we'll be able to put something on again next year. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and have a good weekend when it comes.